Peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul.
You know, as we live in this life, there are a lot of things that we hear, there are a lot of things that we see, and sometimes we hear them and we see them on a daily basis. We hear things that have to do about life. We hear things that have to do with the way we live, and we hear things throughout life just to do with everything. We live in a world where technology has changed the way that we talk. It's changed the way we communicate. And it's changed the amount of information that we're able to receive on a daily basis, and sometimes even on a moment-to-moment basis of information that we can receive. It's also made a lot of things more popular. Technology has made the television more popular. Now the household number of televisions is rising. We have more and more, and every day they create a new one and better one, and everybody wants to have the best. Radios are constantly changing, and we're able to reach longer and longer distances with the radio. And matter of fact, you think about cell phones, and we can listen to anything, we can watch anything, wherever we want to, whenever we want to, however we want to. You know, technology has changed this world, and technology has made it to where we can view things and see things and hear things. There's something that I find very interesting when thinking about our subject of this morning, the first miracle that's recorded in John chapter 2, and you can go ahead and turn there. We'll spend the majority of our time in John chapter 2 giving an introduction to our lesson, and then we will spend the last part of our lesson this morning in question form. We'll introduce John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, and then when we get finished, we're going to ask a question. What was all of this about? What was the point of all of these things? And really, it's to respond to several things that our world believes in, and our world says, and our world does. So go with me to John chapter 2, and let's just begin there. And as we begin there, we're going to notice a few different things as we're going about this morning's lesson. We're going to notice the place. What was the place, or what was the occasion of John chapter 2? Why was Jesus there? Why was the mother of Jesus there? Why was she communicating with him about the problem that was taking place at the location of which they were at? We're going to notice several proclamations also in ways of introduction this morning, and see the different statements that individuals made, from the mother of Jesus to those that were at the wedding feast and those that were working and serving there. And then we're going to notice the product. We're going to notice the product of all of these things and try to understand what John 2, verse 11 is really trying to point to. Now, all of those things are going to be in ways of introduction. Don't worry, the sermon won't be terribly long. It shouldn't be long at all, matter of fact. But what we're going to try to get to is the point. What's the point of all of these things? And really, what we're going to do in this particular section, we're going to ask a question. How did Jesus view this? Now, we'll get to the this in just a moment. So go with me to the place, and notice with me John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. John chapter 2, 1 and 2, and we'll read these together. And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. The place or the occasion that's in our minds this morning is a wedding. And it's very impressive that this is the particular place that's going to be used in connection with the first miracle that Jesus is going to perform, or as it's recorded inside of Scripture in verse 11. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee. But the place is simply this. In Cana of Galilee, at a marriage feast, the mother of Jesus is there. Jesus is there, and note this in just a moment, we'll see this. His disciples were there. So we know where they're at. We know why they're there, and we also get this little bit of information. They were invited. As you move from the place, I want you to move with me in your mind to the problem. And this begins with us in verse 3. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus said unto him, They have no wine. And Jesus said unto her, Woman, what is this that I have to do with thee? Mine hour has not come yet. They had a problem. And here was the problem, and it could be any problem of any modern marriage today or any marriage of the time we're talking about when Jesus was living at the feast. They ran out of drink. Now, we're going to learn something about this particular drink that we're talking about here, and we're going to get to this in the point. It was called wine. But the question we want to raise is, what is this? What has it to do with all of these things? But we're just trying to, in this moment, understand what's taking place. Jesus, along with his mother and his disciples, they're at a place. It was a marriage in Cana of Galilee. And in this place, there was a problem. They ran out of wine. Don't know why they had this problem. Don't know if they misjudged how many were going to be there. Don't know if people didn't RSVP like today. Don't know if they just thought they bought enough and accidentally didn't get enough, or maybe the delivery was late. We don't know. But we know there was a problem. And we know how severe this problem would have been. Especially ladies will understand this. Men, not quite so much. But at the wedding, everything has to be perfect, doesn't it? The hair's got to be right. The clothes have got to be right. The ceremony must be right. And just as much in tied with that, the celebration, the wedding feast, why, it must be right as well. And it just so happened at this wedding feast, they were out of wine. And Jesus' mother comes to him, and he responds to her, What have I to do with this? Or what have I to do with thee? Now, our world likes to look at John chapter 2, verse 4 and say that Jesus was a sexist. In other words, he walks up to his own mother and says, Woman. But that's not what we see reading here. It was a common phrase of the day, just as much as one would come up and respond to any other. But he says in verse 4, and this is also part of this particular scene that we need to see, Mine hour is not yet come. In other words, this tells us something important. Jesus knew of the problem that was at hand. But even more important than this, Jesus understood that something could be done about it. So you had the place, a wedding in Cana of Galilee. You have Jesus, his mother, and his disciples, and you have the problem, they were out of wine. Now we need to see the proclamations as we move through this rather quickly in ways of introduction. John chapter 2, 5 through 11. As you notice, the first particular section we read this way. His mother said unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. And we read in this particular scene, verse 7, as we move through this particular area, Jesus said unto them, Fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said unto them, Draw out now and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bear it. As we move further, it says, When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water which was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants, notice this, which drew the water knew it, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and said unto him, Every man at the beginning does set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse, but thou hast kept the good wine until now. You know, in this particular scene, there are several different proclamations that are taking place in this particular area. And we see in this particular scene one proclamation that begins in verse 5. His mother said unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. Inside of the proclamations at the wedding feast of Cana of Galilee, with Jesus is there, his mother is there, the disciples and all the wedding party and other guests are there. The mother of Jesus says, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. We learn something in this particular scene of this first miracle being recorded here in the beginning of miracles of Jesus. Jesus' mother had great faith in him. And we need to learn a lesson from that. Anything that Jesus was set to do could be done. Anything that needed to be done, it could be done by Jesus. And there's something we need to learn in our lives as well. We must learn that type of faith. We must have the type of faith that can proclaim whatever God is going to do, whatever God has said He's going to do, it will be done. It's impressive to see how she describes it. Whatever He saith unto you, notice these next two words, very small but very big, do it. That's proclamation number one. Proclamation comes number two after the scene is said in verse 6. Verse 7 says this, proclamation number two, fill the water pots with water. It's very crucial for us to notice this because we're seeing something in verse 11. Verse 11 reads in the beginning, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee. Jesus here in this particular scene was proving forth the miracles of which He was going to do. So He tells them in His proclamation, fill the water pots with water. Here's proclamation number 3. It happens in verse 8. He says unto them of which filled it with water, draw out now and bear unto the governor of the feast. In other words, take to the one who would have come to you with the problem of no wine. The New King James Version describes it this way. He's the master of ceremonies, or He's the master of the feast. We would call that a coordinator or maybe a caterer. He was the one that was in charge with making sure everything was lined up as it needed to be. And He would have been the one tasked with the problem of not having any wine. So we see this particular scene. They drew it of the feast. They took it to Him. And it's impressive of this particular scene what was said. In verse 10, every man at the beginning does set forth good wine. And when men have well drunk, then that which is worse, but thou hast kept the good wine until now. That's a very crucial scene for us. That which they had provided in the wedding party or in the wedding feast was considered to be of lesser quality than that which Jesus provided to this wedding in the proclamations. Then we notice the last thing, the product of this particular scene, and we're already on the slide here of John chapter 2, verse 11. John chapter 2, verse 11 reads this way, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested His glory, and His disciples believed on Him. Inside of this, we learn two things, really three things. Number one, this was the beginning of which Jesus was going to do miracles upon this earth. And it was impressive of which Jesus had already said, my hour is not yet come, in the beginning of this account. And then in verse 11, this is the beginning of miracles which Jesus did in specifics of Cana of Galilee. But we learn two things from verse 11. Number one, we learn that it manifested His glory. In other words, this miracle, or this first miracle, proved unto us the glory of Jesus Christ. In other words, He was not just like mere mortal man, but He was the Word which was made flesh. He was the one in which has existed from the beginning and in which will exist unto all eternity. He was the beginning and the end, as you read in the book of Revelation, the Alpha and the Omega. He has always existed and will always exist. But here's the impressive part. His glory is being shown. And this is the impressive part about that. He was able to overcome the physical problems of this world. He was able to overcome turning something that which was water into something else, able to show His abilities on this earth, able to show His abilities of all things, and it manifested His glory because we know something. No one else could do this. No one else could give forth this display. No one else can take water and turn it into anything else. It's something of which only God could do. And we also see in verse 11 that His disciples believed on Him. Now let's try to move in this particular section to the point. What was the point of this miracle? Why did Jesus do this? Why at a wedding of which His mother was there, His disciples were there, of which they were invited, the wedding at Cana of Galilee? Why would He choose forth to show this particular display? Well, when we're thinking about this, we need to understand something. Jesus was showing His power over this universe to display His glory. You know, the entire Old Testament scriptures pointed to a time in which the Messiah would come. And we understand as we read the Old Testament giving much of the answers to the New Testament, that the one of which was going to be the Messiah was going to be one of which would display his power over this world, display his power over this universe, and it would be done as something in which would show forth his glory. Now, we understand that, I believe. I think we understand that Jesus was showing that he was above this world, that he could control this world, that he could change the elements of this world, and that he could do things that this world has never seen. But you know, when we think about this particular idea, there's something that else comes to mind. You know, there is a song, it's a country song. It's a few years old now. I don't know how old it is, and I don't even know really who sings it or who wrote it or what they had to do with anything. But I want you to listen to these 4 lines of this country song. It says, "'Cause I heard Jesus, he drank wine, and I bet we'd get along just fine. He could calm a storm and heal the blind, and I'd bet he'd understand a heart like mine." You know, John chapter 2 has long been the use of many for looking at the word wine. This morning's lesson is not just to look at the power and glory of Jesus Christ. It's not just to look at the fact that Jesus Christ could show his display or display himself over this universe, but it's for us to ask this question: what was this wine? Our world has this view that this wine was, and I'm going to have to use this word, alcoholic. I think we all, and sitting in this room, understand this phrase. We understand what that means. We understand what it causes. And the question becomes, if Jesus created alcoholic wine, why can't the Christian? But that's really not the question, is it? The question is, what type of wine was it? Now, to do that, we need to spend about 3 minutes understanding the word wine, both in the Greek language and the Hebrew language. Now, we're not going to look at the word, but we're going to understand how this word was used as it moves through Scripture to help us understand something. And to do this, we're going to follow something that we know about Jesus. Jesus understood the Old Testament Scriptures better than anyone alive. Matter of fact, as you walk through the ministry of Jesus, you'll understand that he relied on them, many times quoting from and using as illustrations the Old Testament Scriptures. Jesus knew these Scriptures greater than any. The question becomes, are we willing to look at the Scriptures as everyone? To do that, let's notice 3 Scriptures. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 5, verse 11. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 11. Now, when you look at the word in the Hebrew language and in the Greek language, you'll need to understand that there is neither a positive or negative word. There is just one word, wine. And it is denoted by the context of which it is. To what type of wine is it? Now, we understand that there is wine or things made from fruits of the vine in which can be fermented to be alcoholic. And we also understand, and I'm going to use this phrase to help us get it, we understand we can go to Walmart and get Welch's grape juice and it have no alcoholic properties to it. We understand the 2 different types of this word, but we need to see how they're used. Look at Isaiah 5 and notice verse 11. It says this, "Woe unto them that rise up early in the morning." Now that's not what God is saying, just that they rise up, but read the rest. "That they may follow strong drink, that continue unto night till wine inflame them." You're going to find phrases like this in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 11, and you can see many in the book of Proverbs, which we'll look at 2 here in just a moment. But you'll be able to see that wine is used, number 1, in a negative sense, in the sense that it uses to alter the mind, in the sense of which it causes one to do something he would never do or be in an altered state of being. And usually you'll see phrases like this, strong drink or strong wine, and it gives us the negative context of that word. Go with me to Proverbs chapter 3, and let's notice another word. Proverbs chapter 3, and let's see it in the positive light. Proverbs chapter 3, and looking at verse 9, reads this way. Notice how it begins. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. We understand as we look at this word, and as we can look through this word in various occasions, that wine is used in one of two ways. Number one, it's used as it's used in Isaiah 5:11, in a negative sense. And number two, it's used as it is used in Proverbs 3, 9, and 10, in the sense of new, as in no longer or not have going through the process of fermentation. Now, I don't know quite the science behind all of it, but we understand that if wine is left long enough, it will eventually ferment. And in other words, gather together the properties of what we know as alcohol. So the point in this particular scene is the word's used twice. But go with me also in Matthew chapter 9, and let's see something that Jesus said here. Talking about wine, we'll see another phrase to help us understand that Jesus knew wine can be used in a sense of good, in a sense of positive, and it's done so in a new and old illustration in Matthew chapter 9, verse 17. Verse 17 says this, neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out, and the bottles perish, but they put new wine into new bottles, and both are, notice this, preserved or secured. They're not going to flood out of those old bottles. You see, we don't think of bottles as we do think of them in Matthew chapter 9. But most wine bottles of this period and age would have been made out of some type of leather or some type of cloth in which it would have been sewn and sealed. Some type of material which could have expanded and contracted with heat and cold properties, and even with the properties of fermentation, the gases of which it creates. Now, he's telling us something and showing us a principle. This word can be used in the positive light. No man puts new wine in old bottles. Why? Because they've been used up. But a man will put new wine in new bottles. So it shows us the idea that Jesus knew that this word was used in a positive light. But our understanding also tells us that Jesus knew it was used in a negative light. Go with me to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1, to see a phrase that Jesus would have been familiar with. Proverbs 20, verse 1 reads this way. Wine is a mocker, and strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Now we have to ask the question in our minds to logically go through Proverbs 20, verse 1. What type of wine is being used? Is this in the positive sense, or is this in the negative sense? And you look at it again, as you look at the first phrase, wine is a mocker. Now as we start there, we get the idea that it's being used in the negative sense. But in the next phrase, he's going to make this point clear. Strong drink is raging. We start to get the idea of what he's talking about. The wine in Proverbs 20, verse 1, is that which can alter the mind, that which can alter the thought process, that which can change the way we live. It's used in a negative context. And that would have been something that Jesus would have known. The positive and negative contrast of wine. You even go to the book of Habakkuk. Go to Habakkuk chapter 2. And you will see that wine, even in this particular occasion, is used in a negative context and would have been something that definitely Jesus would have known. Habakkuk 2, verse 15. And this will help us understand what wine is being used in John 2, 1 through 11. Woe unto them that give his neighbor drink. Now press the pause button for a moment in your mind. Is there anything wrong with giving a neighbor a drink? Now I know our minds are kind of racing to the rest of the verse because we've read this before, most likely. But would it be wrong for me to go give my neighbor a glass of water? Or maybe a nice, refreshing Coke? Would that be wrong? Read the rest of the verse. That puttest thy bottle to him, now notice this, and makest him drunken also. We understand as we look through Scripture, there is the idea of positive and negative uses of the word wine, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And we learn in every occasion that the word wine is used and seen in the negative sense. It's talking about drunkenness. Now, what is John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11 talking about? Did Jesus provide wine of which would get one drunk? Matter of fact, here's a question you could ask yourself already. The wine that they had at the wedding that they've already partaken of, was it wine of which would have the ability to get one in the state of drunkenness? As you notice with me, go to John chapter 2. And I want you to notice John chapter 2, verse 9. We're going to look at John 2, 9 and 10. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew of the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and said unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine. And when men have well drunk, then that which is worse, but thou hast kept the good wine until now. We need to understand something about logic and reasoning and about the word drunkenness. The word drunkenness can mean many things, but one of the things we need to keep in our minds is it means an altered state of mind. In other words, something has caused the mind to be altered. Now that infers something of the liquid variety. We understand that in our world today there are certain drugs that one can take that can alter the state of mind. That's not the description we're talking about, even though we would just say as much that the use of cocaine with the child of God would be just as much sin. But we understand that the idea of drunkenness is used when talking about wine in the negative sense. We do ask this question: does the context of John chapter 2, 1 through 11, promote a drunken state? I would suggest to you, and I, matter of fact, would affirm to you, that the context of John 2, 1 through 11 does not show a drunken state. Because after they had went through all of the wine that they had at the feast, at the wedding party, they noticed the difference. They noticed that that which they have now been given was better. You see, the idea of drunkenness would have kept them from understanding that, would have kept them from knowing the idea of something had changed. But it all rolls down to the point of what Jesus was describing in this particular area. And that happens in John chapter 2, verse 11. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed on him. Jesus Christ was one who knew the Old Testament scriptures better than anyone alive. And we can affirm, we can know that the Old Testament scriptures talk about the negative side, the sinful side of drunkenness or old wine. And we can understand that Jesus would have known the difference between that. And we can also know that Jesus would have known Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 15. That whosoever puts the drink forth to his neighbor, or the idea there, the bottle forth. Isn't it interesting that alcohol is still in bottles, and we even imagine it today in bottles of a sort? But whosoever brings that to his neighbor to get him drunk has committed sin. And thus we can understand that Jesus, knowing Scripture, would have not violated Scripture to push forth that he was the Messiah, to show that he was the one that had power over all. Matter of fact, it shows the restraint that Jesus had to not make something that would have caused others to violate the law of God. The first miracle that Jesus presented. I know there's a lot that could be said about that miracle. There's a lot more that could be said about that miracle, but we need to understand this. Jesus, in everything that he did, in everything that he said, and in every action of which he committed, followed the laws of God. Matter of fact, you read in many occasions that Jesus was here to do the will of the Father which sent him. You know, this morning you can be like Jesus. You can obey the will of the Father. The will of the Father for all of mankind is to be saved. God does not want one to be lost. And we understand that in Scripture we know the difference between sin and righteousness, between right doing and wrongdoing. We know those contrasts exist from the Old Testament to the New. And even in the day and age in which we live, which is saturated with sin, saturated with temptation, and filled with worldliness, we can understand that God would want us to live appropriate lives.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea